All right. Hey, Larry. I am very, very happy that you came over to talk about your book and that you agreed to to this interview.
It's a pleasure.
And as you reminded me that here in South Whidbey we don't put on airs, so we're just talking as one human being to another,
Yeah. Yeah.
or one mentor to another.
Right, right. We share that trade.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
right. So, can we just start with you and how you grew up? When did the notion of mentor, or whatever the functionality is of what it means to be a mentor, when did that first enter your mind? Was there something about your growing up years, though, that set you up to become interested in that?
Well, I grew up in a pretty conventional suburban Boston community, and I didn't think about mentors. I didn't actually have the name mentor in my brain until years later, when I was actually in higher education and began to focus on what a mentor was. However, I had mentors before they were named.
Okay.
And I think that's true with many people.
I think that's
Mentors don't require the label to be mentors.
Right.
And and in fact, I count three people as primary mentors for me. I came out of a fairly sexist world, and they all happen to be males. I think that's both a function of the times, and also that. Well, I think we learn different things from men than from women often, not necessarily, but looking back, I know that there were many women who taught me enormously important things that men probably would not have been able to teach me. Almost certainly not. But that's a
So let's go back to high
Yeah.
school, because there was this one question about about what would happen if we instituted a mentor system in high schools. Would you, when you look, or K through 12, when you look back, do you think that you had mentors when you were going to school?
You know, I don't. Let me draw a simple line on this one, and I'll tell you why I don't. I had very good teachers. I had very bad teachers. I mean, all of us had both. And yet I was so unconscious through high school. There were models. There were teachers I really liked. But, you know, there's something about the transformation of authority and mentors that has something to do with, these have to do with each other. Part of the mentor's work is to enable and enhance a transformation of authority for students. And until I was really in college, authority was pretty locked in, and I would say developmentally fundamentalist in my little brain. And that means you're either beholden absolutely to authority, or you reject absolutely authority. But the authority still was quite firm for me.
And when you say that you were pretty unconscious
Yeah.
at that time, you see that as a function of your upbringing?
Well, partly.
Conventional
Absolutely.
upbringing.
Yeah.
So you weren't ready for mentorship?
I think you could say that. The other piece, though, is that I think a mentor's role is to bring us into a kind of consciousness, and I both agree and disagree with Sharon, my spouse Sharon Parks, about this. Her specialization is young adult development, and she maintains, and I think she's right about this. She maintains that a true mentor shows up when we're moving through or ready to move through the transition from conventional to post-conventional thought. And by that, that's developmental talk
Right.
for moving from that kind of adolescent world in which we take the tacit world as given largely, and don't develop at least a very vigorous reflective critique on the world. We may be anti, but it's not a reflective critique on the world until we move into what in the developmental scheme is often called that, or Keene, for example, calls the shift from the interpersonal to the institutional, from his stage 3 to 4. That transition was hugely important in my own life personally, and I saw it again and again and again in the lives of the adult students that I worked with. Is that transition from conventional thought to post-conventional thought, and what it requires is the capacity to get underneath the assumptions of conventional thought, and to kind of lift it up and look at it as a phenomenon, a thing that, as Keegan says, it's something you have rather than something you are. And that shift is really important, and that's what mentors, for whom I prefer to use the term mentor, really mean. That's what they really do.
But
yeah.
they can only do it when the student is ready. Well, there's the question about the resistance to mentoring. Yeah.
Yes,
so
you mentioned that question.
Right.
Yeah,
but did you? I missed reading that piece, the readiness for mentoring.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's probably not there. I think, I mean, it isn't as though readiness happens in a vacuum.
Right.
Readiness happens when all of a sudden you read a book that just begins to kind of pry open those assumptions you've held all along, or when you see an authority figure. This is Bill Perry talking here. When you see an authority figure who differs with what you've assumed to be the truth all this time with your parents or your community, and all of a sudden there's a little ray of light that opens up underneath the system you've been living inside of. And mentors, was the mentor responsible for doing that initially? Were you ready or weren't you ready before that happened? I think the assumption I make about learning and learning as meaning making, which is really an important piece of my assumption about it. There's learning as knowledge transition, and then there's learning as meaning making, and I'm more interested in the second. But the assumption is that where was I going with that? No, I lost my track.
Okay, then
Help
can
me
I?
out.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know that I can bring you back on track, but I went on my own
Good,
on my
okay.
own train,
Yeah.
which I would love to bring.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about what difference this would make in terms of other ethnicities, for example. So thinking about growing up African American in this country, which to some extent may set you up already to post-conventional thinking, in terms of questioning institutional values and assumptions about how things are supposed to be, because when we're not part of the mainstream, then there are different questions that come in. So I'm wondering if the fact that there seems to be more mentoring happening in African American communities, for example, where the concept is so much more embraced, I wonder whether there's a relationship.
That's interesting. And I mean, the quick answer is I have no idea. But when we wrote Common Fire, we talked with many of the people we spoke with were African American or otherwise outside of the prevailing culture. And we found that being at the edge of or outside of the prevailing culture uh, when it was well held
Mm-hmm.
in a mentoring world,
Mm-hmm.
was a huge advantage and
Mm-hmm.
did, in fact, create a consciousness, a critical consciousness
Mm-hmm.
that people would carry forth in their later in their work. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in fact, in Common Fire, we have a whole sequence of mentor protege relationships
Mm-hmm.
in the African American community. We follow it through from Dorothy Height
Mm-hmm.
to two other, actually, three other
Mm-hmm.
people, African Americans, who were mentored by Dorothy Height and then by the woman we called Valerie,
Mm-hmm.
and then by another man, and then by a protege of his.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those, that mentoring was very powerful
Mm-hmm.
in that community.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no question that
Mm-hmm.
what mentoring can do is both hold your identity,
Mm-hmm.
in a case like that, your counter identity, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose, and also enhance your consciousness about what it means to be that counter identity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little abstract, but you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, but yeah, there, there are so many factors that come into play when we look at, at, at what it means to be ready for mentoring and how that readiness can be established, either consciously through systems and individual relationships, or how it establishes itself through through systems that may advantage or disadvantage others.
Yeah. So all right. So this is why this is a great question.
Uh-huh.
Is that, and I remember now where I was going with that.
Uh-huh.
Is that the presumption of much of developmental theory is that development happens in interaction with the environment. It
Right.
doesn't happen de novo. It doesn't just sort of happen. We don't grow without some kind of nurturance, support, or challenge.
Mm-hmm.
It's the challenge support thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, while there may be a kind of a ripeness for a mentor to come along, as educators, we can create the conditions in which that ripeness further ripens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's that old line: when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Right.
And if you assume, as I do, that mentors are really projections,
Mm-hmm.
that we simply project this archetype. I don't want to go too Jungian here, but I think it works.
Mm-hmm.
If we project that we simply project an archetype of the wise old person onto this person who is sitting with us and knows more than we do and may have been places that we want to go and appears to have something that we're drawn to, and has a certain amount of power over us. So we also need to take that into account.
Yes.
If that's all true, then part of the work of mentors is to honor the projection, not to discard it right away. You know, sometimes, well, you know, I discourage mentors from going, "Oh shucks, I ain't all of that. You know, I'm just folks."
Ah.
I think it's important for mentors to understand the power of the projection,
Mm-hmm.
even as they work to loosen it enough so ultimately, like a husk, it can be sort of drop away. But
so that can get us into the psychotherapeutic realm,
right,
which is
transference.
Transference.
Right.
But it can also get us into the mystical realm. Does one have to be a mystic in order to be a mentor?
I shouldn't think so.
Well, if mentoring, if in order to understand archetypes and value them, one has to be mystically inclined. And if mentoring simply constitutes a functionalist relationship or an instrumentalized relationship, then can it be mentoring?
Well, I think there are bazillions of people who consider themselves mentors and who are superb mentors who would never consider themselves mystics.
Mm.
So I wouldn't impose that expectation on people who are drawn toward being great teachers or great mentors either. I just think that, and I'll speak just for myself, that uh, that the mythic imagination, which is a little different from mysticism, but the mythic imagination is a particularly powerful imagination for understanding, in my way of seeing things, for understanding what mentors do. After all, a mentor is a mythic character. Mentor was drawn from the Odyssey and from Greek mythology and so on. And and understanding his role. The first thing I did when I got that title of mentor, when I began working for a program that called me a mentor, and I began to wonder what a mentor was, is I went back and reread the Odyssey. And I reread it all the way through because it's actually a pretty good story. But I read it particularly to see how mentor functioned with Telemachus, what his relationship was with this young man. And it was somewhat instructive, although not entirely. And as you know, we read the book. I also then took this as an excuse to read the Divine Comedy for the first time. It had been a book I always wanted to read, but I hadn't gotten to. And of course, reading how Virgil mentored Dante was actually more instructive in terms of watching a mentor at work as he leads this guy down through the great transformative dissolution of Inferno, down underneath the legs of Satan, back up, and then takes him up the 7-story mountain of purgatory, and there's Dante learning all of these lessons, and there's Virgil right beside him, pointing out and saying, this is what this means, and think about that, and the 7 deadly sins and the 7 stories. It's lovely stuff. And so having a mythic or imagination, that's my old English teacher stuff, it fed my way of thinking about how mentors work and what mentors are. And so one of my favorite things is I wrote about the magic of mentor. I said, look, there's a lot of magic here. What I meant is that this is projection, right? And magic is not really magic, really magic. But it's a particular consciousness about how sleight of hand and how people see things and what they do and don't see and how they miss seeing things. So
suspension of disbelief to some extent.
Yeah.
And all that needs to be there in order. Well,
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it is. I mean, I think it's really valuable. And where I was going to go with that is fascinating. Not long after the first edition of the mentoring book came out, with, I would say, the world's worst title. The first title was Effective Teaching and Mentoring.
Yeah, that sounds instrumental.
Oh, God, it was awful. But Lynn Lukow, for whom I have eternal admiration, was my editor at the time, and Josie Bass, the publisher at the time, mainly sold books in catalogs. You couldn't walk into a bookstore and buy a Josie Bass book. And so they had to have titles that were very explanatory.
Right.
And very nailed down and pragmatic. And so I had no say in that title. They titled it. And it was only when the second edition came out and this third edition that I was able to use my own title. But that's just a little interesting sidelight for anybody who's interested in writing books.
Right.
Where was I going with that? I've lost
I'm not sure,
yeah.
but we have gone. Every direction we have taken has been a wonderful direction. So I was just rereading the last chapter,
Oh,
where you
good. I'm
talk
glad you read that last chapter.
which
Yeah.
wasn't in the
No,
earlier
it isn't in
version,
the earlier version.
right?
Yeah, right. This is,
And
yeah,
there are wonderful um, considerations about the connection between mentoring
yeah,
and wisdom.
yeah, yeah.
And there is, you say, that is, this kind of wisdom is not so much about solving problems as it is about achieving right relationship. A
Mm.
relationship not merely with other people, but with existence itself. Wow!
Whoa! Absolutely, that's true.
Wow.
It's true. It's true.
So, can you say more about what that is, and right relationship with existence itself, and it makes
Mm,
me also think about nature,
yeah,
and
yeah,
how you talk about how nature was so very important in your leadership training at the Whitby
yeah,
Institute,
yeah,
the swamp, and
yeah,
so
yeah.
can you
Well,
take that and go wherever you want to go?
yeah. Well, where I went with that, and the reason I said that is that I mean that really is the mystical me. Okay, that's the conviction that the work of the evolution of the soul uh, is about continuing to engage more profoundly with the radical interdependence of all things. And for me, one of the insights that seems to be achieved by people whom I admire, Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, who incidentally, I don't know if you know, he
Is
just,
in a coma,
yeah, sad.
but he's still alive.
Yeah,
Right?
apparently
Yeah,
he
yeah,
is. Yeah.
right.
Anyway, but there's a great soul,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a man who clearly, and he's written about it, has this wonderful consciousness of interdependence, interbeing.
Right,
He uses
right.
that term, um, and I view that as a kind of I don't want to say endpoint, but when I talk about our work as our spiritual work as being moving toward greater wisdom, which is profoundly a spiritual challenge or question, that it does involve our relationship with all being, and that means, and that does mean understanding uh, how interconnected we are and how ultimately we are all one.
Yeah.
It is all one. I mean, that's kind of the end point, but or at least an end point. We don't know where it goes from there. So that's why I wrote that. And let me say, for the sake of students and people who are hearing this, that this does not for a split second mean that to be a mentor, you have to think the way I'm thinking right now, or have that kind of, that particular spiritual orientation. I think to be a good mentor, you have to care about your students. And I wrote in that chapter on caring. I think that it really begins with recognizing the importance of the relationship itself, and of the ongoing well-being and ripening of the learner. Not just becoming who she really is in a kind of a romantic sense, but becoming who she really is in relationship to the world she's in. Because I don't want to get stuck in simply assuming that somehow in the human soul, if just left alone in isolation, would flourish and become perfect. It's bigger than that. It's how the human soul engages with the world in the process of becoming greater. And that's really, for me, that's really important, because I'm not a romantic educator in that sense. I mean, in the sense that somehow there's a seed within the soul that can grow exclusive of its environment. It matters enormously what the environment is, who the mentors are, how the mentors relate, how the teachers relate, what material they read, all of those things go into the formation and evolution of the soul. And I use the soul for people who don't like that language. Just substitute Freud's word psyche, which is only a translation anyway. So,
so strong ecological component, very strong embeddedness.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, well, I had a chapter I called the ecology of development or something like that in the mentoring book. And let me put this out also, since you asked. Just this is for students who may be interested or looking for some new directions, or for some promising directions for research. I have pled over the years with graduate students to focus as much, if they're interested in the developmental theory, if they're interested in seeing how students develop, I have pled with them to look at the ecology within which students do or don't develop. What's the relationship going on between a woman who returns to higher education and her husband, or her lack of a husband if going back to higher education broke up the marriage, which
happens a lot.
Happens. And how about her friends? How about her children? How about her work life? How about keeping the family together? All of those enormously important and not peripheral factors in the work of becoming a riper human being. And our job as mentors, I think, in higher education for adults, is to care for that whole self. That's just fundamentally important, and so it's important for us to know something of the stories of our students, where they've come from. And so I have begged students to, and one guy did pick it up and did quite a good study of the environment of students as they evolved. But I haven't seen the book yet on it yet, and I'd love to see a book that really talked about the ecology of learning. And there is a book called Learning Through Relationships, which was a very good one years ago. I've forgotten the author's name now. That was the title. Anyway, that's I think would be a great project for graduate
it is
students.
wonderful. And so let me make the connection here and see if I see the connection here between the ecology of the relationship, or the embeddedness, and healing.
Absolutely. I thought you might go there, because I was going to go there too.
Okay. So that is where you make the connection. So what was going on in your own learning and your discovery process of the mentoring relationships when you wrote this quote? And I'll read that.
Well, let me back up a little bit, because I think it's only fair for me to say that I wrote this book while my marriage of 15 years was falling apart, and we had two children, and they were young, and it was excruciatingly painful for me what was going on, without getting into the details of our separation and divorce, let me just say that I was in a good deal of pain during those years, and writing the book was an important part of kind of emerging out of it. So the metaphor of healing certainly had something to do with what was going on in my life, and doing the book, and doing that mentoring, which I was doing all through those years, was very much a part of my life at the time. So that's a piece of the personal, and I would add that when 5 or 6 years later I met and then subsequently married Sharon Parks, that really brought the healing in a full circle for me, because we had a conversation around mentoring that we shared, and around development that we shared, because she came out of the same background with the same mentors and colleagues that I did. So it was a common and just enormously precious and blessed relationship, and remains that. We've been married over 25 years now, and it continues to be extraordinary. But anyway, so I began to see with my students, and I mean, your folks who have worked with adult learners know this as well. This is no hot news flash for people in this business, that many of these students come back to higher education after having taken some real blows of a whole range of reasons. So there is a good deal of injury to people's self-concept, to their sense of themselves as learners. I mean, I think we really have to understand that we're working with people who, almost by definition, carry some woundedness. You can't get to be in your 40s, 50s without getting beaten up anyway, to some degree, in some ways, if you're lucky. So I think it's really imperative that we understand the relationship between learning as meaning making and healing. And this is another wonderful realm of research that I would love to see a student do. And that is someone who really has worked in depth with the healing process as medical healing. How does a wound heal? What can the way the body heals itself tell us about the way the psyche heals itself? What's that interplay? And I've only known it as a really good question. I haven't known it as, I don't have a lot of answers to that. I do know this, that folks, that you work with that metaphor. This is all metaphor. But you work with the metaphor of healing, and you recognize that that a wound caused a trauma, and the trauma obviously has caused us to shut down parts of ourselves, or wounds over time. That there's scar tissue. There's a scab, but then there's scar tissue, and then that the scar tissue to be worked with, or there's healing that is healthy healing that is able to heal in the open, and then there's healing which simply scars over, and the whole injury becomes locked in and is inaccessible, rigid. And so part of the work of, if education is about meaning making and transformation of meaning making, if that's what our work is, then you can't separate the body from the whole self. That these things invariably go together, and therefore, as a mentor, how do we help loosen the scar tissue, get some movement, intellectual flexibility, back into those aspects and parts of the self that have gotten locked in place and are frozen in a sense. So you can continue to work with this metaphor, I think, in a lot of ways, but and let me say that in addition to that, of course, that immediately brings up the question, what's the boundary between psychotherapy and mentoring? Big question.
Fluid.
And it's absolutely fluid, and it must be fluid. And I would resist drawing a sharp line. Some mentors are more at ease and adequate and skilled at working at deeper levels. Some are not. And I think it's really important for a degree of self-consciousness, self-awareness from mentors themselves as to how far they want to work with that boundary. If they're uncomfortable with it, don't do it. This is not a requirement. On the other hand, there are some mentors who, frankly, are better than a lot of therapists who are getting paid for it. So, I think it's a question that always needs to be held, and probably should never be answered with a simple answer anyway. I think that for me, the way I worked with it in my work, I was not a trained therapist. I was not unaware of therapeutic language. I'd read enough psychology and so on to be reasonably comfortable in most realms. But for me, I think let me see how to say this. I definitely, if I saw in a student a really severe situation, emotional or psychological situation, I left it alone and referred the student to a psychotherapist or to somebody who was more professional than I was in that realm. So absolutely, there comes a time with some students and some mentors when that you need to simply recognize this is for referral. On the other hand, people have good friends, and friends sometimes can be a lot more valuable in helping work through some of those issues than a psychotherapist.
And that's part of the ecological assessment, right? What are the resources that individual students have? Where's the trust? Where's the community? Where's the language that they can understand?
And that's what's one of the great things about the cohort programs that I worked in, is that the cohort programs were were groups, and people formed very close relationships with other fellow students, Sharon Parks has also written on leadership, on adaptive leadership, and one of the questions here was mentoring and leadership and what's the interplay.
Right.
And and Sharon likes to say, adaptive leadership is a particular approach to leadership that has been most promulgated by Ron Heifetz. Leadership can be, Sharon's book is Leadership Can Be Taught. Ron's book was Leadership Without Easy Answers was his first book, and he had several others. Anyway, but Sharon likes to say that if you're going to do adaptive leadership, and what makes the link between leadership and mentorship that I would point to is that adaptive leadership that really believes that that the challenge in significant problems is a learning challenge. In other words, a leader's job is to manage a learning process among the people he or she is working with. That's a kind of mentoring.
Yes.
And so adaptive leadership as an idea is certainly closely related to what mentorship is. They're both concerned with managing a learning process. Now, it's somewhat different in leadership because usually there's a more concrete, specific goal and not so much focused on the individual learner. But they're both about managing a learning process. And Sharon likes to say, this is where I was going with this, she likes to say, if you're going to do adaptive leadership, don't ever try to do it alone. You just don't try to do leadership alone. It's always a matter of managing a whole system.
So don't do it alone as a leader and a mentor. Find a community of other leaders who do the same.
Well, to the degree that you can.
Right.
I worked when I was teaching a mentor in the Vermont External Degree Program. We had a team of about half a dozen other mentors, and we spent a lot of time together talking about our students and talking about our notions about learning and talking about
Yeah.
what the issues were, and it was very valuable for
Yeah.
all of us.
Yeah,
Mm.
I'm really glad that you're speaking so much about leadership because several students in this class are really, really interested
Yeah.
in leadership as well.
Mhm.
And yes, I see the importance of the collective at every level, not only for the students but also for the
Yeah.
mentors.
Yeah.
Um, And maybe the next question is then linked to that in some ways, but I wanted to get a little bit into the question of hope, um, which it seems that you make a really strong connection between wisdom and hope. Somehow there is no wisdom without hope. There's all, and maybe this is connected with the flexibility of mind and with um, and maybe it's also connected with the fact that in order to sustain the hope, there needs to be a community of others who can hold that vision.
Thank you for that, and
Okay.
thank you for that question because holy smokes,
Mm.
I mean, I'm really in the middle of that right now.
Mm.
Totally in the middle of that question for
Really?
myself right now.
Yeah.
I'll tell you why in a
Yeah.
second. One thing I just want to mention before we go there is Sharon and I also talk about the importance of a mentoring community.
Yeah.
And that's a concept that we still want to continue to really put out there. I mean, we didn't exactly invent it, but we have always spoken frequently about uh, the fact that a mentor may be enough to promote uh, learning and development in a kind of individual, personal, one-to-one situation. But if you're really interested in promoting larger scale systemic change, it's very, very important to think about what a mentoring community means, and even for individuals to help our proteges, our students, understand how they are in a mentoring community. They may already be in mentoring communities; they just haven't named it that. You know, what a great exercise it would be in working with a student to sit down with the student and say, well, who's in your world, and who out there can help you deal with some of the more personal stuff, who can help you with the more practical stuff, who can help you with the immediate sudden needs when you need a book or you need help with your computer, or what is your mentoring community? What's your support system? And to really help students be more explicit about that, because that's important learning.
Mind mapping.
Well, they could do it as a mind map. They could do it in a lot of ways, but to really be conscious about the learning world that they're already immersed in. What are they already learning from? And that helps them then begin also to see where do they want to go to learn more, or to learn more specifically, etc. So, but the hope question. The reason I mention that is that, as you know, I've been working in environmental issues in a pretty focused way for the last 20 years almost. And of course, over the last 3 or 4 years, particularly since my granddaughters and now one grandson were born, I've been focusing very sharply on climate change and its implications for the future. And anybody who knows anything about the science and who respects the science knows that the more you learn, the scarier it gets. And all of us, I think, have to pull up a certain degree of denial if we're going to retain our sanity, almost, to consider to be actually contemplating the end of the world, at least the end of the world as we know it, is enough to make anybody crazy. And a lot of people are crazy who go around carrying signs that say that, you know, I mean, that's the... So I'm, when I say I'm really in the midst of that question, I am. Now, I have found that the best antidote for what happens to you when you start staring down that dark hole and seeing what it looks like in another 50 years, maybe 30 years, maybe 20 years, maybe soon, when you start looking down that hole, the best antidote, in my experience, is to start acting, is to act, to take action. And there are a lot of ways you can take action. In my particular case, what I've done is gotten together with a team of people to host a series of conferences here at our institute, Whitby Institute, for active climate change activists and people who are really in the trenches, who are working at this and struggling with this day after day, and are able, as one woman said, who's in a think tank working with this issue all the time, to help them deal with the fact that they can't talk to their kids about what they do. And or at least if they do, it's a very delicate conversation. And she said, we don't even talk about it with our colleagues very much, because we just don't want to get sucked down into that place. But ultimately, we all know that we need to address what that's stirring up in us, or we'll burn out, or we'll just go cynical, or etc. So
scab over, exactly.
So that's what I've. So in order to address that, for me, working at that, I'm trying to raise money for that, and I wasn't born to raise money, and that's not my thing. But I care a lot about this work, and it gives me a sense of, I know that I'm working at it, and I'm going to be able to look my grandchildren in the eye as long as I'm still alive, and they will know that at least their grandfather was working at this and doing something about it, and wasn't running in the other direction or in denial. So, hope. I'm still in the process of trying to figure out what the relationship is between hope and wisdom. But the first thing that I know, and you'll only get some sort of half-formed thoughts about this, Suzanne, but the first thing I know is that there are degrees and levels of hope, some of which are not particularly helpful. A kind of naive or authority-based hope, I think, is not particularly helpful. I do not hope that somebody is going to come out of the sky and save us. Whether it's Jesus, or whether it's some other savior, or whether it's science.
These are the beginnings of a developmental theory of hope.
Well, it'd be lovely. I wonder who's done that work. It would be terrific to. There's another great thesis to begin.
Yeah.
How do we develop, and how does hope as a concept evolve in the human soul? Because there are those fundamentalist, kind of dualistic, authoritarian, authority-based notions of hope, and then. And there's certainly a point, it's that abyss that Bill Perry writes about so well, where you fall into multiplicity and relativism, sort of shallow relativism, and then the danger is cynicism. You either become cynical, or you retreat and you become a fundamentalist of some kind, an economic fundamentalist, a technological fundamentalist, or a religious fundamentalist. And you look for some kind of solution, some savior, without having to look at what it is we can do ourselves in our own transformation to address this issue, knowing that we don't know how it's going to come out.
How we can stay in relationship with hope itself.
Yeah. And I think that requires a transformation of the meaning of hope.
Mm-hmm.
Several transformations, actually,
Mm-hmm.
which is why it's a developmental theory, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. So that when I talk about sort of wisdom as some kind of mystical understanding of interdependence, and I also, I think probably we can talk about hope as being connected with a sense of our radical interdependence.
Mm-hmm.
But I just was just the other night listening to Stephanie Kaza, who's a wonderful environmental Buddhist who teaches at University of Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
And Stephanie was talking about, or gave rise to a couple of interesting notions about hope.
Mm.
One of them is, what's the relationship between beauty and hope?
Mm.
And she asked us that question.
Mm.
And it occurred to me in addressing that question, I think when we are in the presence of extraordinary beauty,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it could be as simple as a sunset, it could be a flower, it could be another person.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it happens to be close-up views of moss.
Very beautiful.
Another story.
Yeah, yeah.
But when we're in the presence of extraordinary beauty, or a Grecian vase, beauty cuts through cognitive processes and goes to something deeper.
Mm-hmm.
When we are in the presence of extraordinary beauty, it's what awe does for us.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a religious or spiritual experience. And what we mean by that, I think, is that the cognitions shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes an immediate experience. It is just an experience.
It's an aesthetic process.
It's not even a process, I think. I think it's just a presence.
Okay.
The beauty just cuts right through and goes to a different place in our brain or in our soul or in our whole self. And, you know, and then, of course, the mind gets back in, starts clicking away and makes its own meaning out of that. But the immediate experience, I remember, all right, so there I was in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and oh dear, brain fart, the great French Impressionist painters, water lilies, help. Monet, thank you. The Monet exhibit was there, and they had arrayed 7 of his paintings of the cathedral at Rouen beside each other. And I walked into that room and I looked at them and I just burst into tears. And I am not, you know, I mean, I don't go doing that left, right, and center. I mean, I had never actually looked at a work of art and burst into tears, and I just did. I just lost it. I wasn't thinking. That wasn't my cognitive brain at work at that moment. So here's the thing that I think beauty and contemplation of beauty may kind of move us into a space that cuts beneath despair, because despair is usually a function of something we know. I think. So that's one thing, is beauty and hope have some kind of an interesting relationship. The other is deep time. And as a result of Stephanie's she also asked us to think about deep time and who we are. So I went back and kind of redid the arithmetic of deep time. Because I think, I mean, I had some senses of it. But, you know, if you sort of start with the age of the universe, okay, 13.8 billion years, okay, and then you cut back to the age of the Earth, 4.6 billion years, and then you cut way down, say, to the appearance of the first appearance of land plants, moss, between 400 and 500,000 years ago, and then you cut to, say, the dinosaurs, between something like 230 million years and 65 million years ago, when they all got obliterated. And then you cut back down to the Paleozoic, to the Pleistocene time, which is 2 million years ago, and that's sort of the Ice Age. And you then cut back to 5 or 6 ice ages before the Holocene, and now the Anthropocene, because they're referring to this time now. The Holocene starts at 11,500 years ago, about the time of the civilization, and then move to the Anthropocene, which is present. Well, by that time, if this is the age of Earth, not just the age of the universe, but the age of Earth, 4.6 billion years, then if you just take a fingernail file and file the end of your nail off, you've just obliterated the entire period of human existence. It's like a filing from your fingernail in deep time.
That's amazing.
So, what are we doing? Yes, we're obliterating the conditions under which human life and all of our accompanying furry flying beings, some of whom have been around a whole lot longer than us, were putting their lives in threat, and certainly the 6th great extinction, all of that. But there's no question that life is going to go on. So, and the universe will go on, and all of that kind of stuff. So at least deep time relativizes the issue of despair. Whether it gives us hope depends on what you hope for. Everything depends on what we hope for. And we have to be realistic about what realistic hope is. That was a long way around kind of trying to address that. But I think beauty and deep time are two ways of beginning to shake up our brains so that we can think more richly about what hope might mean or might not mean.
Yeah. And then hope can also be a more open concept, not directed towards some goal, but it can
absolutely it can't be.
Can be a state of consciousness, a certain way of orienting toward the world, as
Exactly.
Kate Davis says, quoting Václav Havel.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think we have been talking for over an hour, and it probably...
You'll need to cut some out.
We'll close it up.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking me, Suzanne. I wasn't sure I had anything to say. I guess I had something to say.
You were right when you said that this could go on for weeks.
Yeah.
I'm deeply grateful that you took the time to talk and to really delve into your thinking. And if I had any questions about the validity of doing an interview in addition to reading a book, then this was very, very much confirmed, because there are so many ways to get more deeply into some concepts that are just touched on the surface in a book.
Well, you should let your students know that if they have questions or want to explore something, they should email me, and I'll give you my email. You have it, actually, and so I sort of authorize you to put me in touch with them if that's something that
Thank you.
they want to do. I can't promise a quick response. That depends on how long it takes us to raise the money for the project, because I'm a little obsessed about that. But in any case, I'd be happy to do that. So.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.